All right. Hello, everybody. So welcome to the New York Media Meetup. If you are looking for the panel on Substack, you are in the right place. So thank you all very much for making the time this evening. If you are kind of zooming in from New York, I know we're in the middle of a snowstorm here, which is very exciting. So thanks for taking a break from that and joining us tonight. Before we get into the discussion, I want to just briefly introduce myself and the meetup, and then we'll move on to the panel. So I am JJ Colao. I run a PR firm called Haymaker Group here in New York. We work with technology companies like Etsy, ZocDoc, Handy, and Drift, among others. Before I started Haymaker, I was a staff reporter at Forbes, where I covered startups and technology and venture capital and kind of that whole world. So we started the New York Media Meetup about 6 years ago in 2014. And for those of you who haven't been to one of these before, we try to do them every quarter. We usually don't make every quarter. But when we're able to do this in the real world, we partner with NYU and their journalism school and get panels together to talk about sort of the craft or the business of media. And obviously these days we're doing that online, virtually. So thank you again for making the time. And now we will move right into the panel. So as always, we have a fantastic set of panelists for you this evening. I will start off with the first, who is Hamish McKenzie. So he is the co-founder and COO of Substack, which if you're joining us tonight, you probably know what that is. But if you don't, it makes it very simple for a writer to start a paid newsletter, and it's kind of a big deal these days. Hamish is a writer himself. He published Insane Mode, which is a book on Tesla and Elon Musk. Previously a freelance journalist for a couple of different outlets, including Time Out Hong Kong, Pando Daily, and others, and wrote some hard-hitting stories on the World Beard and Mustache Championships and a couple of other topics. So next we have Polina Marinova Pompliano, who's the founder of The Profile, which compiles the best long-form stories on successful people and companies. Polina, how many words did you read last year?
Like 8 million or something.
Yeah, which is the equivalent of, I believe, 120 books. So she's culling through all of that for you and for those of you who read The Profile. And before she started The Profile, and I guess partly, while you were a writer at Fortune, you were a writer at Fortune and you ran the Term Sheet newsletter and also had previous stints at CNN, Aussie, USA Today. And then last but certainly not least, Alex Kantrowitz, who's the founder of Big Technology, which is an independent newsletter and podcast, focuses on big tech companies like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. He is also the author of Always Day One, which is a book that looks at those tech giants and how they plan to sort of maintain their dominance. He is also an on-air contributor at CNBC, which is very fancy, and was formerly a senior tech reporter at BuzzFeed. So with that, want to pass it over to you all. And first, just to kind of set the scene here, can you just give us a sense of where you are, what your current home life situation is, who you're with, that sort of thing, how the last 9 months have been? I just want to kind of ground it, in how you've been living over these past couple of months. So Hamish, why don't we start with you?
Well, thanks for having me as part of the panel. I'm in New Zealand at the moment. I'm a New Zealand native. I'm in Wellington, the capital city. I brought my family here, my wife and a 3-year-old boy and a 9-month-old boy. And it's been quite a big transition. We're up in San Francisco. We're in San Francisco up until we came here, and we came here about 3 weeks ago. Pandemic is, it's been, a challenge for everyone, I'm sure, but San Francisco was a pretty good place to be for most of that time. I'm pretty grateful to be in New Zealand where it's summertime. I'm sorry to hear about this snowstorm.
Okay, I'll go. So for the majority of quarantine pandemic, I was in New York City, but today, me and Anthony, who is my now new husband, managed to escape from New York City a few hours ago to be in Miami. So that's why I was running to this Airbnb.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am in San Francisco, from New York, so definitely missed those snow days, but I guess it doesn't matter very much anyway. And yeah, I've been here in San Francisco. I have a couple of roommates. The one directly behind this wall got COVID in March and breezed through it and somehow didn't transmit it to the rest of us. So we're antibody free in the other two rooms.
It's good to know. We want to ask everybody else's COVID or antibody status. We'll let that stay a secret. But Hamish, why don't we start with you? And just to kick things off, at least in terms of the topic at hand, would love to hear a little bit about the genesis of Substack, the thought behind it, obviously informed by your experience as a writer. And so just want to hear about how it came to be and kind of what the vision of it is.
Well, my friend Chris, who's the CEO of Substack, was previously one of the founders of a messaging app called Kick, had hundreds of millions of users, and ultimately was kind of supplanted by Instagram and Snapchat and the likes. But he, after a good 9 years at the company, decided to like step away and think of what else he's going to do in the future, and was taking time off. And in that time, he wanted to get back to doing more writing, and he was working on this blog post that he shared with me for my feedback. And the blog post was about how the dominant media economy was working in such a way as to incentivize bad things like the spread of divisive content and misinformation and things that attract a lot of attention, but don't necessarily contribute to trustworthiness or good storytelling or good societal outcomes. And this essay he was writing bemoaned the state of the world. And he shared it with me for my feedback. And I said, yeah, all these things are true. And everyone who works in media knows that these are the problems, but people don't know how to do something productive about it. What's a good solution? And if you're going to write this essay, at least include a couple of paragraphs suggesting an alternative. And he took that feedback, and instead of finishing the essay, he proposed that we start a company to do something about it, and that the company should try to create a new system of rules for an alternative kind of media economy that's not based on online advertising and therefore engagement and therefore these big AI news feeds, and instead be based on direct payments between readers and writers and subscriptions, which monetizations of sort of trust relationships rather than engagement. And we thought if we could do that, then maybe some interesting things could happen. And that's what led to Substack.
That's very interesting. So it started out really by observing kind of the dominant trends in the media as an industry and the effects that those trends were having, on society at large. And it sounds like it was less about, your personal experience as a writer and that sort of thing, at least in terms of what sparked the genesis of the company.
Well, one of the consequences of the media ecosystem, like working in this new way as brought by the big social media giants, is that newspapers were shutting down and journalists were losing jobs, and it was becoming even less stable than it was before for reporters working in this world and writers working in this world to find sustainability. So that's something I personally really did care a lot about, because I have a lot of friends who are losing jobs or jumping into other industries, because it's not that you can learn, it's not only that you can't, it's very difficult to like succeed financially in the media, but it's actually really difficult just to subsist, just to get by doing the kind of work that you think is meaningful and that you believe in and that's important for democracy. And so one of the beauties of this model, I think, is if it can work at scale, it can help address some of the broken media ecosystem problems that are causing problems for society but it can also help writers flourish.
Got it. I want to put a pin in some of those bigger, kind of societal impacts just for later in the discussion. But for the moment, would love to shift it over to Polina and Alex and get a sense of your kind of personal journeys. So obviously you were both at, I guess not legacy media outlets in the case of BuzzFeed and Alex, but certainly like big, largely well-funded, well-known media brands with big newsrooms and that sort of thing, and lots of resources and a big platform. And you made the move to Substack and to go independent. And Polina, maybe we can start with you. Would love to hear about that thought process and how you kind of evaluated that decision and what brought you.
Yeah. So I joined Fortune in 2014, and because I covered entrepreneurship and venture capital and these small business owners, I was always like entrepreneurially curious. JJ, I don't know if you remember, but we got like maybe drinks in 2015 or 2016. And I was like, what do you mean you left Forbes to start your own thing? Like I was always like curious about it, but I never saw myself actually making the jump. I genuinely thought I would spend the rest of my life at Fortune magazine, just because like I'm pretty risk averse when it comes to that. And both of my parents moving here from another country, I saw them work jobs that were just like paycheck to paycheck. To me, having a big corporate job with like benefits and health insurance was, I have made it. So then when I started the profile in 2017, the landscape was kind of like people were getting laid off across media. I was lucky to keep my job, but I got switched to a new beat because I was working on a section called Fortune Venture that ended up getting shut down. So they're like, what are we going to do with you? And they were like, you're going to cover Uber and Lyft and whatever. I wasn't very interested in these like larger startup things. And I didn't have many sources. So, I mean, I was covering it, but I had a lot of free time. So I was like, what can I do that I actually love on the side? And so for me, the answer was the profile. And so when I started it, never in a million years would I think that I would ever leave my job for a newsletter. But when I started it, Hamish, I was trying to find the email, but Hamish sent me an email. He was like, hey, we have this thing called Substack. I see you're using MailChimp. Do you want to move over? And I was like, absolutely not. Because at this point, I had been on TinyLetter, then I was on MailChimp, and I was having trouble with deliverability, and things were going to spam. And I was just like, oh, just another, like email platform. So instead of moving to Substack, I stupidly went to something called MailerLite, which was even worse than MailChimp, and I just had a bad time. And then finally, I told Anthony to start a newsletter on Substack. Ironically, he started it, and through him, I saw that deliverability was so good. Like his emails were not going to spam. So I was like, okay, well, and you don't have to pay. It's a free platform. So I finally moved over to Substack in 2018, and yeah, I quit my job at Fortune this year in March because Hamish had a really tough love talk with me over bagels, or not bagels, croissants and like tea in Manhattan. And I was like, I don't know, should I go? And he was like, if you don't leave right now, I will be mad. And I was like, okay. So it's been great.
Okay, but beyond Hamish's persuasiveness, which I'm sure is considerable, there had to be real factors at play. Like you had to see a path to financial viability here. And I know we've spoken since, and it sounds like you have, achieved viability, but would love to hear a little bit more detail as to what that looked like, prior to March and leaving.
Yeah, just very quickly. So the profile, since I started in 2017, it has always been free, but I have never missed a week of publishing it. So every single Sunday, readers could count on the fact that this newsletter will be in their inbox. So I decided to start experimenting with the paid layer in January of 2020. And against Hamish's advice, I jacked the price up at $100 a year and $10 a month. And to see, would people pay for these 2 extra sections that I was adding to it? People paid, but it was the hardcore, really loyal people who loved the profile. And it was okay. It was a good amount of people, but it wasn't enough where I would feel secure to leave Fortune. And so then I lowered it to $50 a year, and that exploded. And it was thanks to a lot of feedback from readers saying, hey, I wouldn't pay 100, but like I would pay 50. So I got enough of those emails where I was like, okay, maybe that's good. So that kind of got the ball rolling. And then I saw, just working on Term Sheet at Fortune, a daily newsletter, I kind of saw the shift before, every reporter started quitting their jobs and moving over to Substack. I saw this like trend of people trust people, and the people who subscribe to Term Sheet may never go on fortune.com to read articles, but they will open Term Sheet every single day to read it. So to me, it's like, oh, okay, they do that because they trust me, they like the writing, and Term Sheet has a reputation on its own. So I saw the same thing with the profile. I saw the same thing with other people's newsletters. And so I was like, if this trend continues, I would love to kind of be at the forefront and do this. And now is the time. And before I left Fortune, I did the math, and I was like, actually, and Hamish helped me, like, how many people do you need to get to your salary at Fortune? And I'm happy to say that I think this month I surpassed it.
That's very exciting. And honestly, I did not realize how integrated into the story you are, Hamish.
Yeah.
So that's great.
You just needed to help to like get to the confidence she needed to make the jump. She already knew what the right thing to do was.
Alex, how about you?
It all starts with Hamish. Well, it does really. So I wrote a story. He pitched me on this story about how writers were making money on Substack in 2019 when I was at BuzzFeed. And I was like, yeah, it's bullshit. Give me the real numbers. And, most companies, when you say, give me the real numbers, they're like, well, it's this percent. You like percents, don't you? And it never tells the full story. And Hamish was like, okay, here are the real numbers, and here are some writers you can speak with. And then I realized that this was a real thing. And so I had been writing a newsletter at BuzzFeed called the Tech Giant Update, and luckily I had made an agreement with them that if I were ever to leave or get fired, I could take my list with me. So it was always in the back of my mind. Then in April, I released my book, Always Day One. And it was obviously a terrible time to release a book. And one of the interesting things that happened was, while I was, right before the pandemic hit, I was having all these interesting discussions with editors at all these different publications. And before I went to BuzzFeed, I was at Ad Age, and before that, I was a freelancer. And when I was a freelancer, I found it extremely difficult to place stories. I mean, JJ was a contributor at Forbes, and that was sort of the only way I could get my stuff out regularly, but I wouldn't have a lot of success pitching editors. And while we were doing promotion on the book, I was like, wait a second, editors are actually answering my emails now, and at places that I would love to publish with, and about stories that I wanted to write, that were sort of extensions of what I was doing with the book. So I knew that there would be an opportunity to do some freelance work if I were going to leave BuzzFeed. And then it just seemed to me that this was an opportunity. So BuzzFeed was going through some financial troubles, and I kind of sat back and I said, do I want to leave my fate in someone else's hands, or do I want to take the momentum I have now, which might not be something that I can replicate down the line, and actually try to do something with it? And so actually, if you look at the post that I wrote when I said I was going to Substack, I was just reading it last night. Substack is number 3. And the first thing is doing freelance stories. And the second thing is promoting Always Day One. And the third thing is hey, I have this newsletter. And then I just threw in a podcast for shits and giggles. And that's actually been a really nice vehicle since. But so I make this announcement. I'm going independent. Lots of people signed up to the newsletter, and I think Hamish read the post, and he goes, "Look, I see that you want to write for other publications. They'll pay you once, and your readers will pay you every month. So you should probably put your best stuff on Substack. And I thought that was really profound. And I had also, like, as a newsletter writer, I think kind of like what Polina is touching on, the relationship between reader and writer on a newsletter is amazing. People really invest and read the stuff and they reply back. And you don't have to use like big publication voice. You can use eyes and talk about your personal story. And I found that really rewarding. And so that's when everything kind of shifted. And so I said, I'm still going to do freelance stuff, but now Substack is going to be number one for me. And I publish every Thursday. And it is sort of that extension of the book and covering the tech giants in the way that I want to. And it's really been a blast. So it's like 6 months now. And I was like, let me do this as a couple-month experiment. And now I'm pretty sure that I'm committed to doing it for all of next year as well.
You know, when I put this panel together, I did not realize how personally involved Hamish would be in each of your journeys. And I feel a little bit left out here.
JJ, have you considered starting a newsletter?
Yeah, well, I'm going to need to sit down with Hamish, apparently, who's going to persuade me.
We can talk. We can talk.
Yeah, cool. we'll talk. But Hamish, to go back to you for a second, would love to get a sense of kind of, the universe of Substack. So there are a lot of different topics, writers, et cetera. If you're able to, would love to put some numbers on it in terms of writers and subscribers, and what topics do well, what percentage of these newsletters are free, what they typically charge, just kind of any texture you can give.
Yeah, there are thousands of writers on Substack. That's the most public thing we say. Millions of active readers. It's a really big ecosystem now. More than 250,000 paid subscribers across the network. So it's a little bit out of date. It's a bit higher than that, I can disclose.
But that's also up, I think, from 100,000 in the spring.
Yeah, there's been a pretty rapid growth period over 2020. And top 10 writers and publishers on Substack collectively are making more than $10 million a year. I think the majority of newsletters on Substack are free. There are some people who introduce paid subscriptions and treat it as either a side income or a sort of pocket money or a full-on business. And so some of these writers are like Paulina, like replacing their salaries with Substack. And in the real top tiers, they are getting quite wealthy from their Substack revenue, which is a nice change for writers, I think. I think that provides some general texture.
That's very helpful. When you were having these discussions with Polina and Alex, and I imagine you have some version of these discussions with many, many Substack or prospective Substack writers, what kind of advice do you give in terms of, well, certainly it sounds like you give some pricing advice. I imagine the schedule and cadence and maybe type of content is also something you'd speak about. And is there anything else sort of along the lines of what these folks should keep gated and what they should give out for free and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the fundamentals are pick a beat and own it. Like occupy a niche better than anyone else in the world can, and use and lean into your distinctive voice and worldview, because that's what people come up for, and that's what people appreciate. Then be consistent, like publish, like pick a cadence, pick a schedule and stick to it. Don't just be like a fair weather publisher. Don't just publish one thing one week and then wait a couple of bits and weeks and then do another thing. You've got to establish that reading habit. And when it comes to how to think about the paid subscription model, and of course it differs from writer to writer. Some people are writing hardcore sort of hedge fund type analysis. Some people are writing long personal essays, and some people are writing high metabolism news coverage. But in general, a good thing to think about is making your best stuff, your most accessible stuff, the stuff that's most likely to be popular, your free stuff, because that has the potential to travel widely, be shared around a lot on social media, and grow your mailing list, which is the whole spine for your business. Because when you have paid subscriptions, it's always going to be some function of that overall mailing list. And it tends to be a pretty constant function. Often it's about 10%. And so you keep growing that mailing list, that 10% gets bigger and bigger. One way we tell, another way of phrasing it is you can think about the paid stuff as more like in the weeds, more of a sort of intimate connection. It's not necessarily your showpiece stuff. It's like for your true fans, for the nerds, for the devotees. So the free stuff is kind of like your concert, and the paid stuff is more like the backstage pass.
That's helpful. So it's a little bit counterintuitive in that you're putting your best stuff out there for free. You're keeping, the inside baseball, the stuff for people who really want to go a click deeper behind the paywall for the, rabid fans.
Yeah. And I think this is a good model because you can kind of have your cake and eat it. A lot of journalists are worried about like losing impact or losing reach if they start publishing in the Substack model, but you can have that wide reach still with the best work, the stuff that is most important to you, the stuff that you've put the most time into. And then the people who are paying to subscribe are paying for kind of this deeper relationship with you, where they get to see more of the world through the filter of your eyes. And that can be like something as simple as discussion threads or access to the comments, or it could be like deeper dives, or it could be like personal letters. One thing I wouldn't say to the whole world, but I might just say to you guys, my insiders here, is I really struggled with this issue, blah, 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 blah. And that's an effective model we've seen work time and time again. Got it.
Does that ring true, Polina and Alex, in terms of your experience? And I'll leave it at that. Let's stick with that question for the moment.
Yeah, so when I added the premium layer, I didn't want it to be exclusionary. Kind of like, I wouldn't, if you have been with me since day one and you've been getting this newsletter for free for 3 years, I didn't want to be like, okay, all of a sudden it's going to be behind a paywall and now you have to pay to get what you've always gotten. So what people had always gotten was a column at the top and then 8 or 9 curated long form profiles on people or companies. I was like, that will always stay the same. I'm adding 2 other sections, which are audio and video recommendations of podcasts, documentaries that I saw, that I liked, that I thought were interesting. And the biggest thing that I added after I left Fortune was the profile dossier, which is a deep dive, like Hamish said, just a little bit more, a deep dive on an individual person every Wednesday. And it's like really deep, and it's for people who really want to learn from one person instead of kind of like clicking around on curated articles. It's a little bit of more of original content, but my whole idea is not looking at it as a paid subscription, but kind of like a membership club. So when you join the profile, if you pay this membership fee of $10 a month or $50 a year, I'm going to continue adding stuff for the premium members, so that like it's more additive than like subtractive. That's not a word.
We'll take it.
Go with it.
Yeah. Alex, how about you?
My newsletter is still totally free. So you should all subscribe to it, bigtechnology.substack.com. Did I do that right, Hamish?
Like and subscribe.
Model student.
Thank you. I just, so for me, the idea was like, let's give this like 6 months and then send out a user survey and kind of see what the story is. So by the time, so I guess this is going to be kind of a long answer, but by the time, I'll try to make it as short as I can. When I brought my list over from BuzzFeed, we sent 3, it was 25,000 people. We sent 3 emails, and anyone who didn't open, we cut. Hamish remembers this well. I was like, no, let's keep them all. He goes, do you want to be in spam? I'm like, no. He's like, all right, let's cut. So I was like, all right, cool. So we went down to 5,600, and I was like, let me just try to grow in the first 6 months. So I've been doing that, and now the list is close to 7,200, which has been a nice bump. And by the end of this panel, we'll be at 7,300, which is cool. And so I kind of looked at it as like a hub and spoke model, where like the newsletter would be like this kind of home base for me, and I could use that to find other forms of revenue. So I syndicate it with 10, and that brings in a decent amount of revenue every month. and then I started this podcast, so we're selling ads on the podcast, and that's working well. And then CNBC has also been a nice thing that came right through the front door, which was good. And I go on like 3 or 4 times a month, which has been sweet. I'm trying to think where else revenue comes from. And then I also signed on with an unnamed publisher to do a narrative, yet to be named. I will name them soon. Do a narrative podcast about a tech giant. You guys can put the pieces together on that. And so that's been kind of fun. And then in the middle is the newsletter, which is sort of getting my my stories and viewpoint out there. And so I did this survey to my users or readers a couple of weeks ago saying, what would be of interest to you if we go paid? How much would you pay? What do you like about the newsletter? What do you think could be better? And then just give me like anonymous demographic, information in case I want to sell an ad at one point. And I'm sure we can talk about that because Hamish has a viewpoint on it. But what I found was people really wanted some more. They wanted more newsletters for paid subscribers. They wanted community stuff. So like exclusive subscriber only Slack is something people were interested in. They wanted monthly subscriber conference calls, and they wanted like live podcast recordings where like I could tape on a Zoom like this and then let people ask questions and be part of that. So I think if you add that all together, you can get like a nice base of people who'd be interested in like a membership type of thing like Polina described. I think that's a great idea. So that's probably the direction, I'll go next year. So like probably in the first quarter, I'll turn something like that on. And then also, probably put an ad in the newsletter, for an advertiser who would like make sense for this type of stuff that I'm writing. And that's kind of what it looks like.
That's really interesting. It sounds like your audience is hungry for interaction, both with you to some extent and with each other as a community. Everything that you described seems to fit that theme.
Definitely. I mean, it's not like, so when you write a story and you just blast it out, onto the internet, like it's just like a moment in time. But like the cool thing about the newsletter is that it is, and I said it earlier, but like it's this back and forth where we start to get to know each other, both me and the people that respond. And then when people tell me I'm an idiot and explain why, I say, hey, can I put this in the newsletter? And if you sign up, you'll see tomorrow we're going to have a little bit of dissent that will come in, and that's good. So it is this definitely, it's weird, but it's definitely a community of folks for me. I mean, people who are interested in tech and the tech giants and like what's going on. There's a commonality there, and the newsletter brings them together.
That is fun. It's a conversation. It's a two-way
Exactly.
street.
Well, email's back and forth. I send you, you send me. And so like, that's how a newsletter should be too.
You've made it when you make a typo in the newsletter and more than 5 people respond to let you know you made the typo.
That sounds very fun. So Alex, you actually anticipated one of my questions, which was about revenue. And Polina, I know you have a bit of a different mix, so would love to hear, how you pay the bills every month.
Yeah, so the bulk of it definitely is subscriptions from Substack, but I was so nervous when I left Fortune that I wasn't going to make enough money that I started like panicking. So in the beginning, I decided to freelance and to kind of like offer that up as something I would do. But the nice thing is I think I've only freelanced one article. It was a Q&A with Josh Wolf for The Hustle, but my deal with them was, I'll do this, you'll pay me, but also you include a link to the profile in the main Hustle newsletter so that way like I get some growth. That was nice. And then I've also, one revenue stream that I didn't realize was a thing is licensing. So there's a company called 5 Media. They asked me if they could license some of my articles. I said yes, they paid me a fee, etc. And then I've also experimented with sponsorships where this venture firm, for example, because I have a podcast section, they were like, we have a new podcast coming out. I listened to it. I liked it. It was actually really high quality. So I let them sponsor 4 issues of the profile, and I would include one sponsored podcast recommendation that I like. It was actually good. I would have included it anyway, but I made sure to say like this is sponsored. So that has been a revenue stream. And then it's interesting. Substack actually has, which I never thought anybody would pay me more than the $50 a year, but they have like a founding membership. So anybody who wants to pay you anything more than $50 a year can do that. And the default is at $100. But then one time I was looking and I got somebody who paid $1,000, and I was like, oh no, this must be a mistake. So I emailed her like 3 times and I was like, hey, like happy to refund you. I'm so sorry. And she was like, nope. Like she turned out to be this media philanthropist who just wanted to support independent journalism. So that was also really nice. So it's been kind of a variety of things, but the bulk of it has been direct subscriptions.
Just to piggyback off what Polina said, I think it's interesting that like when we're doing this on our own, like we kind of start to see the value of owning our content versus a publication owning it, because then if someone wants to license it, we can make those deals ourselves and share in the upside. And if someone wants to sponsor it, the ad money isn't going to go to, some other publication. It will go to us. So
and you could,
nice.
And you could be selective about the sponsors, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So just to, I don't want to delve too much into your personal finances, but just to give this a little bit more context, are you matching what you made as a gainfully employed journalist at these larger outlets? Are you surpassing it? Are you on track to surpass it? I think it would be good to give folks a sense of what the economics of this look like at that level.
Yeah, so I was on track to surpass it, and now I have surpassed it, including everything that I've done, not just the subscriptions. But the interesting thing is that for me, it's been awesome to see that people actually value my writing. I think my biggest fear coming out of a big media organization is the only reason people read it is because it's Fortune magazine. And I found that it's actually not true. And during the pandemic, people, once they exhausted all the junk food content, they actually wanted high quality content and they were willing to pay for it. So I think that that's been a nice learning and a nice surprise, and like a good, it's going to trend that way, I think, in the future.
Yeah, I think in this 6 months, I've definitely done less because I haven't turned paid subscriptions on than I would have otherwise. But I would say there's a pretty good chance that if everything goes according to plan in 2021, then I should do better than I was doing at BuzzFeed.
Great. That was my sense as well. But it's nice to hear. So Hamish, I want to get back to you for a second. It sounds like there are a couple of things I'm hearing in what Polina and Alex have gone through. One is that there's a mix of revenue for a lot of these writers, I would assume, if they're representative. One, important stream of that is certainly the newsletter subscription, but you're throwing podcasts in there, licensing, some maybe sponsorships, et cetera. How does Substack think about that? The model as it stands now, as I understand it, is sort of a 10% cut of paid subscriptions. Is that going to change? Are there other thoughts around, supporting these other revenue streams, or I'll leave it there?
When we are philosophically opposed to putting advertising in the product, writers might go ahead and do it on their own, and that's kind of fine. But it's mostly because we are 100% focused on subscriptions, which we think is an incredibly powerful model and not yet fully realized. And so one of the trade-offs, if you go the advertising route, you're making a clear trade-off, which is that you can no longer say to your subscribers, this is 100%, you can have 100% certainty that this is purely supported by you, the readers. You are my customers, because other customers start to creep into your view. So an advertiser is an undeniable class of customer. And in some cases, that is going to be, especially early on, that is going to be the easier money to go get, because you just get a big chunk, it's from one person. And then, and I'm an extremist on this, and like not all of my colleagues agree with me even, but I think it's important to have an extremist on this in the world, because then your model adjusts, your editorial model adjusts to fit the funding model, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in profoundly obvious ways. For instance, a podcast is often like an hour because it's kind of like suitable for a slot at the front, a slot at the middle, and a slot. So we want to encourage this exploration of new territory and exploration of a new world based on direct payments between readers and writers. We think that that's much more exciting than the old world that we're all moving out of, which is advertising, which is being done to death and is failing many types of institutions. I actually think that the sometimes a little bit harder decision to make, but smarter decision to make, is to be purely focused on subscriptions. Tell people that this is how you make money. This is how this publication is supported. If they believe in this mission as much as you do, then they are buying your intellectual freedom and your editorial independence and a reading experience that is built for them and no one else. And that we've seen the people who are the most successful on Substack, the people making the most money are following that model, and they're making a lot of money. This is like people who had top jobs at national magazines who have switched over to Substack and have quadrupled their income. But of course, we're not people's bosses, and the ownership element is crucial. Writers make their own decisions. They're running their own businesses. They own everything on Substack. They own their content. They own their IP. They own their payments relationships. They own their mailing list. They can take that all with them anytime they want. And we're not telling them how to do their businesses. We just give them the best advice that we can based on what we see succeeding across the platform.
That's pretty compelling. You may have sold me on this. So I do want to get into some of the trade-offs here, kind of, in terms of, in the professional sense. I guess one thought that I had is, Alex, I saw your interview with Emil Michael from Uber, which is a reasonably, big get as an interview. I think when I was a journalist, it was remarkably easy to talk to just about anybody because I have the Forbes brand, in my email. I think sometimes for freelancers, for those who don't have that brand, it can be a little bit harder. Are there issues like that you have run into in terms of your day-to-day job? So are there issues like that? And I guess on the other side, are there things that are just easier and better that you didn't expect?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be people who are going to be like, I haven't heard of you. Sorry, not talking to you. But like, this was part of the experience for me at BuzzFeed. I'm sort of used to this because I came out to San Francisco a little more than 5 years ago. And this was like BuzzFeed was at the early part of its news, push into news. They hadn't really done tech. And every time we wanted to do a story, we had to sort of convince people to speak with us. So it's something that I'm super used to. And I also did it for the book, I was, trying to get people to talk for Always Day One. And, we ended up getting Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon participated. And Steve Wozniak also was in the book. And that wasn't like a BuzzFeed brand, that was just me. So by the time I was done, I was convinced that I could do that. Yet now there are people who will turn me down for the podcast. And of course it stings. Like I got one of those rejections this week and I was like, man, like, why am I doing this? But you'd be surprised how many people will speak. And that's pretty sweet. Each victory becomes sweeter. And in terms of the things that I found surprisingly good about being able to do this on my own, I mean, there's a long discussion to be had about, the role of editors. I think editors are largely good, but there's something so sweet as a writer to be able to just assign yourself stories and then go with it. And if they, succeed, then you say that was a good instinct. And if they fail, you learn a lesson. Whereas before you couldn't make those mistakes on your own. And it's been super interesting to me to sort of figure out, what gains traction, following my instinct and seeing where it's right and wrong, and then learning and adapting based off of that.
Polina, what's your take?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I was not shocked that people turned me down when I emailed them from Paulina, the profile, instead of Paulina at Fortune. But it just means that you have to get a little bit creative in how you approach it. I think if people trust you and you've had prior relationships with them, they're more likely to do it. And the other thing is that by being independent, you also don't have the baggage that some of these media organizations have. Like, I was recently reading a profile in Vanity Fair on Elon Musk, and when Vanity Fair called him for a comment, he said, Vanity Fair sucks. So but at the same time, Elon called up Tim Urban at Wait But Why and let him do this massive feature on his company, because there was no baggage attached to Tim Urban. So I think there is a little bit of an advantage of being independent in that you don't have the baggage that comes along with whatever some other reporter has done in the past.
That's really interesting. So it cuts both ways. If one of your colleagues has, axed the subject and put them kind of like I've done that, where Forbes couldn't talk to somebody for 3 years because
I know this story.
Yeah. So you're not just tied to your own actions, you're tied to your entire newsroom's actions in terms of, how far your platform extends.
There's another cool thing that I think is important to get across, which is that these aren't necessarily small operations. I try to bring this home to people, but people think about the internet and page views and they think in the hundreds of thousands and the millions. And so my newsletter is just 7,200, right? But, let's say we get a 40% open rate, which isn't surprising most weeks. That's 3,000 people that will automatically read every story. And then they share it just like any other, people will. So instead of starting from zero, you're actually starting with a head start of engaged, interested readers who tend to share stories they like. And I've had, stories that have done tremendous traffic, much to my surprise. But once you start to understand the dynamics, you realize that we don't really have such a disadvantage in terms of getting readers that you might imagine versus traditional publications.
And Alex is really good about getting scoops. So other organizations will cite his Substack articles, which is awesome.
When they're behaving. I have, if someone knows the top people at Politico, I have an issue with them. So
I saw the thread. I liked your comments.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Just showing my support.
We'll send them a horse head for you, Alex.
Okay. Yeah. Got to send that over.
That's what Substack does for its writers. You see that? So I have so many more questions, but I do want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions as well. So they've put some in the chat here. And the first one that I'm seeing is from Henry Harvey. And he asks, I think this is going to go to Hamish. Does Substack help with growth / marketing, or is it exclusively a platform for delivery and payment processing? It sounds like it does, but would love for you to elaborate.
Traditionally, we haven't done that much.
Okay.
We've always thought of it as an area that's interesting to explore without betting the company on it. However, today we've done a switch over on our homepage, substack.com, and where you can find newsletters like Big Technology, bigtechnology.com, .substack.com, and the profile.substack.com. And we are featuring newsletters by categories on leaderboards, and then some newsletters that are kind of just handpicked to showcase some quality work that wouldn't have otherwise appeared on those leaderboards. And that is also accessible through a Substack reader, which we've also just launched today, which is kind of it's a web app at the moment. There's no mobile app, but it's a web app to follow all your newsletters in some place. And if you feel like grazing around the Substack ecosystem, you can go do that. And there's also a tool that lets you connect your Twitter account to see of the people you follow on Twitter who has a Substack newsletter. And all these things are maybe not going to be mind-blowingly effective in terms of driving new readers to people in a way that Twitter or Facebook can amplify things. But they're a start, and it's an exploration to see if we can have some effect on growth for newsletters, and we'll be watching that and responding to feedback, and could lead interesting places.
I definitely get a lot of subscribes from the Twitter tool. So thank you for building that.
Awesome. Yeah, I personally built that.
Well done.
Yeah, no, I did not. Obviously, we've got great engineers and great product people, and kudos to them.
Right. And it allows you to plug into an ecosystem of already interested people, people who are interested and primed to consume this sort of content.
I think this is a subtle point that may be overlooked by some people, is that by this stage, Substack is a known thing. People know how a Substack publication works. And they know that, for instance, it's not just an email thing. It's also got a web component, and there is often the ability to subscribe or listen to podcasts through it. And so because people have that mental model in mind, there's not much cognitive work to be done before they make the choice to get on your mailing list, for example. And they know where the button is to push to get onto your mailing list.
Yeah, it's subtle, but it's powerful. And I think, even with something like Meetup, which is different, obviously, but in some ways there's a comparison to be made. We can go on, throw up a topic, put together fantastic panels like this, and plug into an audience pretty quickly. And so it sounds like if you're a writer, that dynamic is certainly in effect at Substack, in a way that's much more conducive to how you're going to monetize, your own work.
Yeah, really interesting point.
Moving on to the next audience question here. Curious to know, and this is from the Publicity Club of New York, what percentage of Substack's current writers are journalists / ex-staffers versus non-journalists or business executives, celebrities, academics, etc.?
There's a wild array of people from all sorts of backgrounds, and the short answer is I don't know. There are a lot of journalists doing their trade and actually just doing sort of hobby newsletters on Substack. We are especially known by journalists, I think, partly because I'm a journalist, and when I started Substack, I went out to all my networks and we started the conversation there, and it snowballed from there. But there are people of all types. I just don't know the breakdown. Sorry. One of the sort of things about Substack is that because we're subscription focused, not advertising focused, we're not in the business of scraping a tremendous amount of data or trying to figure out who you are and where you live and start to target stuff at you. We know your email address and maybe your IP address. And so we can discern certain things from that, but we can't tell who you are, what your job is, what age you are.
It's a perfectly acceptable answer. So I think one more audience question, and then I have another question, but this is from Mike Abend. And his point is that writing a newsletter and hosting a podcast takes a lot of work. Have you looked at lower lift media like curation or long form audio? Polina, I know you do curation in addition to original writing. So I also know that certainly takes a lot of work. But I'll let the two of you take on that question.
So there was a period of time where I was at Fortune and I was writing a newsletter every single morning. Then I was sending the profile on Sunday morning. And then I was also working on a magazine feature at Fortune. So the only day I wasn't sending a newsletter or writing anything was Saturday. And that was probably when I was panicking about my feature. I had so little time that I became really good at prioritizing things. So then when I left and I was doing this full time, I was like, oh my God, I have so much time and so little things to do. So that's why I added the Wednesday dossier. I'm doing more original interviews with people. I recently did a profile meetup around the world, a virtual one. But I'm finding things to do to fill my time, but fill it in a way that actually grows the profile instead of doing mindless things where I'm just doing it out of the pure, I'm just interested in this, I'm going to do it. Every single thing that I do, I'm intentional about is this going to grow the profile? And is this going to reach more people and be interesting to the readers? I'm doing it where I'm a one person operation, and I want to push it as much to where I'm like, okay, I'm going to have a mental breakdown, and then maybe I'll scale back. But until then, I'm good.
Yeah. And
No, short of a mental breakdown. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
Advice.
No, I feel that way sometimes too. I went out and asked my readers what they wanted. And I was like, maybe they would actually want like curated links. So I have my user survey in front of me. So actually, so I said, do you want so I send this weekly article. So I said, you want the weekly article or a weekly editorial with links to relevant stories. So more of a curation, or just like an email with like 3 shorter news items. And the overwhelming plurality decided that they wanted to keep the weekly article up. So, I can move to some of that curation stuff, but if it's not what people want, then it's not what I'm going to do. And in terms of like lower lift stuff, like audio, the podcast has definitely been super fun for me to do. It's not, you might think it's lower lift, but there's actually still a lot of work that goes into, doing a podcast. And, if that becomes the lead horse one day, that's great. And it's definitely like going in a nice trajectory. It started from 0, and it's growing. It was at one point growing like more than 100% a month, which was sweet. But at the end of the day, the core, like this user survey told me that the core of what I do is that weekly article. So I'm going to keep it up.
It's great. Yeah, that makes sense. So we only have a couple minutes left here, but I do want to get to this question, which is, let's assume that Substack is going to continue to grow at sort of a blistering rate, and there are going to be more and more Alexes and Paulinas who are leaving their large news outlets to go independent. What impact does that have on the media overall? What sort of second order effects are we not thinking about? And if that is the case, what does this world look like in 5 years, as opposed to what it looks like right now? And that's for everybody.
I'll go. So it's important to note that I think I was successful in doing this because I was at the right place, at the right time, at the right stage in my career. I'm not sure my Substack would have been as successful if I was to do it 3 years ago when I was just a reporter at Fortune covering, entrepreneurship at large. I wouldn't have that built-in audience that knew me and trusted me and was willing to move platforms to continue reading me. There were some, but I don't think it would have been as extreme. But I do think that the people who are at these organizations and they're like, oh my God, I have a community of people here. People like my voice. I have an okay following on social media, et cetera. I think I could do this well independently. I think a number of those people, and we're already seeing it, are leaving. But it's interesting because I genuinely believe this trend of people trust people will only accelerate. But I think all this unbundling, I think we're seeing it now with like the everything bundle. People are starting to bundle together. And it's funny because it's like you leave this organization only to kind of be part of a media organization. But regardless, I think it's still going to be more personality driven. And I think like Axios kind of try to do it, but I think when it's ground up, it's a little bit more powerful. You know exactly who you're subscribing to. And I don't know, I'm excited for the future of this because I actually do think there's so many voices that are being lost in these large faceless media organizations that will emerge with something like Substack.
Yeah, I want to say I think it's not just limited to people who are in media organizations. There's no barrier to entry. My baby has just arrived home. Sorry. There is no barrier to entry here. There's no one to tell you, don't do this publication. What a stupid idea. And Polina 3 years ago had she had 3 years of developing on Substack and building on Substack, even though she were not known, unfortunately, maybe she would be in a pretty strong place. Depends on, if the right person saw it at the right time or shared it at the right time. And one of the challenges and goals for Substack is to help accelerate that path for writers who don't already have established platforms. And so we can do that with things like the discovery tools we launched today that maybe helps a little bit. We can do that hopefully by connecting writers in some cases with healthcare or editing, which we're starting to run pilot programs around. We can do that by printing the blueprints for success on Substack, like follow these rules to succeed, and connecting people to mentorship, and just generally investing in more community efforts of Substack. There's lots of really challenging things, and it's not guaranteed to succeed. But I think there are so many people with interesting things to say there who can get a small but substantially paying base of followers who can succeed with this model, whether they're teachers or janitors or lawyers, and they can start on the side doing something like this and work to a point where maybe they can actually quit their other jobs and go full time with this, with their dreams on Substack or with a newsletter type business.
Yeah, I don't think that this supplants traditional media. There's been a lot of sniping from journalists who are at established platforms talking about like trying to poke holes in the Substack model and, thinking that Substack is out to destroy that. And I don't think that that's the case at all. I think traditional media has a long runway for it. I don't think it's going away. In fact, you see publications like the New York Times that are stronger than they've ever been in their history. And that's only going to continue. So I think that this, provides an interesting avenue for, some reporters who think that it's a better way for them to do their job and communicate with readers. And then also, like, it's a pretty good safety net for folks who, I think the key to being successful in journalism is to be relevant and be present. You don't want to disappear. And I also don't think we've seen the end of media layoffs or media economic turbulence. And it could be a safe haven for people who, want to try something else if they, shake out of an established publication, or just kind of need a home base for a bit before they jump back, at an established publication. So that's a long way of saying, I think that the traditional media and Substack media work very well together. I think there's room for both of them to grow. I sort of think that one isn't a commentary on another, and we should all be grateful if there are more writers that are employed and able to make a living.
All great points. And I think a very appropriate tone to end on. So Alex, Hamish, Paulina, thank you all very much for taking an hour out of your evenings or afternoons in New Zealand to join us today. Everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us. Stay safe in the snow, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for putting this together.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.